Good morning, and welcome to the second day of the conference on Nawal El Saadawi, writer, activist, and physician. My name is Miriam Cooke from Duke University. I have co-organized this conference with Hind Ahmed Zaki from the University of Connecticut. And I would like to thank Ellen McCloney, the director of the Middle East Center here at Duke, and Griffin for extraordinary work behind the scenes, in front of the scenes. So many, many thanks. So because today we're going to be talking about the way in which Nawal wrote the body, righted the body. For those of you who have the program in front of you, you'll see that we kind of played with right, because of course she was an extraordinary human rights activist. And as I mentioned yesterday, but for those of you who went with us yesterday, last year we had a memorial a week after Nawal died, so at the end of March. And we had a number of people who attended. Fawzy Afzal Khan had another memorial. I think we were a day apart. And so the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, which is the journal that is part of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, published these memorial statements, short ones. So I'd like to show people the journal. And so we have 13 selections in here. And while I'm talking about the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies and the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, I would really like to encourage all of you attending to become members. We have some very, very powerful articles in, and it comes out three times a year. And then, of course, you're part of the association, which meets annually at the Middle East Studies Association annual convention. So one of the people who was participating in last year's memorial was Robert Young. And he pointed out something that one of our panelists, Suja Sawafta, is going to be talking about. He was talking about the fact that she was initially a physician and then a writer. So she moved, I think she always thought of her writing as a result of her education as a doctor. She always thought of herself as being, in some ways, a doctor of the soul, maybe. Her writing is therapeutic. And so I'd like to read just a little bit of Robert Young's piece, because I think it's going to set up our panel for today. And so he says that she needs to be placed alongside two other doctor revolutionaries from the global South, Che Guevara and Frantz Fanon. And he says, there is something in the texture of her writing that reminds me of Fanon. Reading it, you feel that it is always written through the body. There is a physical, phenomenological, processual form of corporeal thinking and experiencing made up of objective descriptions of individualized, specific, external, and internal functioning parts of the body that run seamlessly into a haunting, breathtaking evocation of inner emotions, emotions that are always felt along the pulses and that strike us in a particularly powerful way because they're conveyed with such intense physicality. Like Fanon, she frequently uses medical idioms and clinical vocabulary metaphorically to invoke states of the inner self, Perhaps the deepest similarity between the two, however, lies not so much with style as such, with that striking combination of direct matter-of-factness charged with emotional intensity, but with the constant putting of the self into question. And he quotes from Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, "Oh, my body, make me always a man who questions," unquote. That self is always in question because the body of the Black man, the body of the brown woman, evacuates each from ontology and being. And he quotes from her, "She swallowed bitter saliva and moved her dry tongue, saying to herself in an almost audible voice, 'Yes, I am nothing.'" Like Fanon as a Black man, for Nawal as a woman, being is continually confronted by nothingness, of course, by a vertiginous plunge into non-being whenever recognition is withheld or refused, not because of who she is, because of what she is seen to be. The experience of being emptied out undoes all unthought assumptions, producing in Nawal's writing an extraordinary, indeed a relentless tendency to throw out questions, often posed one after another for several lines at a time. So with that, I think we are prepared for body talk in Nawal's writings. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce our 4 speakers for today. So the first to speak will be Cheryl Toman, who's professor at University of Alabama and currently the chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Classics. Previously, she held the Ruth Mulhauser Endowed Professorship at Case Western Reserve University. Toman's research focuses on African Francophone women writers with a subspecialization in women's writings from the Middle East. She's the author of 2 monographs, numerous articles, and book chapters, as well as the editor of several volumes. She is also a 2-time Fulbright Scholar, including a research teaching Fulbright in Lebanon, and the recipient of a Brown Foundation Fellowship and the 2021 Gender Chair at the Gender Institute of France's Center for National Scientific Research. So I will introduce each speaker before they speak so we don't forget their biographies. So Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And I'm really delighted to be here and very honored to be the first speaker of the second day of this extraordinary conference. Thanks so much to Miriam and Hind for organizing this, also to Ellen and Griffin for all that they've done. So the title of my paper is Reconciliation and Healing in Nawal El Saadawi's in 2 Women in One. So in November 2007, there was a November 2017 recording entitled Walking Through Fire, a conversation with Nawal El Saadawi. And Omnia Amin interviewed Saadawi at New York University's Abu Dhabi's Institute. And in that video, Saadawi reiterated, as she had many times before in conversations in her writings, her contempt, and that's her word, for the medical profession. During this particular interview with Amin, Saadawi described the medical profession as, quote, exploitative and branding it a commercial profession. And Saadawi also pointed out that it was her father who had imposed the medical profession on her as a career choice. So in her 1985 novel, 2 Women in One, Saadawi introduced the very personal inner conflicts she herself had experienced as a female medical student in 1950s Cairo. Saadawi's protagonist, Bahia Shaheen, is a young woman who is, quote, made to feel an other to herself, as Dia Khan explains in her preface for the newest edition of the English translation, which appeared in 2020. In other words, 2 women in one in need of reconciliation. So Saadawi's main character is angry throughout much of the novel. Her parents have dealt her not only 1 unfair hand, but 2, an unchosen career as a doctor, and later to punish her an unchosen marriage. Bahia expresses her anger towards her society in many ways. For example, in the loathing of her fellow medical school classmates whom she encounters daily as they rush to the front of the lecture hall. Bahia secretly mocks her mostly male cohort for having been fooled. While going to school is inherently positive, Bahia knows that education can also become a tool of oppression. Her medical school is creating civil servants, not creative people who can rebel against the system. But Bahia's disgust is not reserved solely for her classmates at the School of Medicine. She also scorns ordinary people on the street and on the tram with their, quote, stunningly similar faces and, quote, on the treadmill of their daily lives. And perhaps more than anything, Bahia is furious with herself for being well-behaved, docile, and obedient. And only when she felt alone in her room could she hear her real voice. But the vast majority of the time, she would act as if her own name did not belong to her, and she could barely stand the sight of it written on her anatomy notebook. And towards the end of the novel, it's Bahia's father who officially puts an end to her medical school days, perceiving this as punishment for her participation in student protests that eventually led to her arrest. What her father does not realize is that she was on the verge of leaving school on her own because of how torturous it was for her to be with those, quote, living indefinitely in chains. Speaking about another of Saadawi's works, Memoirs of a Woman Doctor, Khadija Gay's words expressed in her essay on the subject of tyrannical feminism also apply to Two Women in One as well. So according to Gay, tyrannical feminism is distinguished from feminism, and that a woman actually navigates in the internalized complexes of inferiority instead of dismantling them, quote, inscribing her femininity in an oppressive zone. Guy describes Saadawi's classic protagonist as one traveling through a, quote, journey of self-discovery, punctuated by a war between body and mind, fraught with back and forth ruptures and transitions from the hatred of the body to the cultivation of the mind, until her ultimate reconciliation with herself in her adult life, end quote. So this is very much the path that Two Women in One traces, as Bahia Shaheen narrates this turbulent time for her just before and immediately after her 18th birthday. So similarly to how Saadawi chose to abandon her career as a clinical physician so that she could put forth her true self as a writer, her protagonist, Bahia, cast medical school aside, mentally at first, but in a more definitive way by the end of the novel, to pursue her passion for art and later for a newly found activism that manifested itself through her participation in student protests against the government. In those demonstrations, Bahia also was energized and encouraged as she finally, quote, saw faces different from those she knew from the dissecting room, bodies different from those she had been who she had seen forcing their way into the lecture hall, end of quote. So Saadawi would describe Bahia's decision to control her life as, quote, moving forward to another stage in her medical journey, which is an interesting sentence, actually. So here Saadawi is talking about medicine for the soul, as Miriam mentioned in her introduction. She herself believed that writing was a stronger weapon than medicine in the fight against poverty and ignorance. In an oppressive society, expression through writing and art becomes a primary source of healing for oneself and for one's society. And it's precisely her art that Bahia's father tried to suppress throughout her young life that eventually lures her away from a path of freedom in a society where, quote, all she loved were taboo. All things she loved were taboo, sorry. So if every woman is indeed two women in one, the person that society expects her to be and the person she actually is genuinely and knows herself to be, it is only through citizen creativity that she heals herself, thereby reconciling the two women within her so that she can in turn contribute to the healing of society. Saadawi's once famously said, and although I'm not sure that we all believed her, that she hated teaching because creativity could not be taught. Instead, she saw her role as undoing what education has a tendency to do, namely a stifling of creativity. So in her essays, Saadawi often recalled her days as a medical school student, where she and her classmates were taught about diseased functioning of separate parts of the body, even though they knew nothing of these aspects in the body as a whole. She maintained until the end of her life that nothing has really changed in this regard in the field of medicine. This belief is echoed in her novels, revealing how women are welcomed into the medical profession, only to find themselves alienated within it, treating a body in ways often destructive to them. So body, medicine, and feminism are all at the center of an interpretation of Saadawi's Two Women in One. And this study analyzes this novel by referencing not only Saadawi's own theories developed in her essays written before and after the novel's official publication date of 1985, but it also cites theories crafted by other feminist scholars and writers. So in Two Women in One, One of the most striking scenes occurs in the dissecting room of the medical school, where Bahia candidly asks her classmates, "What does it mean to be a girl?" Her professor confidently attempts to answer her question, even though it was not directed at him. And this is a quote from the novel. So when Dr. Alawi heard the question, he dipped his metal forceps into the open stomach of the dead woman whose body lay before him and took out her womb, a small pear-sized triangle of flesh, soft on the surface and wrinkled within. The base of the triangle was at the top and the two sides converged downward, end quote. So as Bahia stared at him without any emotion of any sort, Dr. Alawi proceeded to answer what he perceived to be the other half of his student's question. As for man, here it is. So with the tips of his forceps, he held up the penis. She saw a wrinkled piece of black skin like old excrement. However, not then, nor at any point in the novel had Bahia asked what it meant to be a boy or a man. The reader now knows that Bahia is, quote, dangerous in the eyes of people who, quote, who don't want a real person, end quote. So it's at this point when she's condemned to become a person who will always be, according to Nawal, hunted down, killed, condemned to death, imprisoned, or isolated somewhere far from other people. Despite the daunting message of this foreshadowing, the reader also senses that Bahia's mind will eventually be free from the restrictions on her body. So the symbolism chosen by Saadawi to write this scene is particularly intriguing. So the positive, or rather the non-negative reference to the pear and the triangle in a representation of the female is in stark contrast to the diminishing of the male to, quote, old excrement. The pear is rife with meaning in ancient Egypt, and to this day, it's widely symbolic of femininity and eroticism, even outside of Egyptian mythology. And this particular fruit also conveys abundance and sustenance. So Cindy Bedworth explains that in the art world of ancient Egypt, pears regularly figured into still life paintings depicting food, not to mention that the goddess Isis considered them as sacred fruit. Indeed, archaeologists have unearthed in ancient Egypt tombs with pear-shaped vessels containing items that were thought to provide sustenance for the dead. And of course, the triangle may remind one of the pyramids of Egypt, which in themselves are a symbol of protection. But in Saadawi's image in their novel, however, unlike we see in the Great Pyramids, the base of the triangle is at the top with its tip pointing downward, a recognized symbol of femininity. So if the myth of Isis is brought into the layers of meaning behind the pear-sized triangular uterus revealed in the dissecting room of two women in one, we have a possible connection to explain why the cadaver's penis is described as old excrement. Saadawi's reverence for Isis is no secret. She even entitled one of her autobiographies, A Daughter of Isis. And perhaps the greatest of all Egyptian goddesses, Isis is mentioned generously throughout Saadawi's essays as well. Together with Ma'at, Saadawi claims that Isis was a symbol of, quote, knowledge, wisdom, and justice, and that slavery came to be only with the destruction of the civilization of Isis, end quote, resulting in an Egyptian civilization and society that was more and more patriarchal. So Isis famously collected the dismembered body of her beloved Osiris and located 13 of the 14 parts, all except for his penis, which according to the legend was eaten by a fish. Because of this fate, the penis would logically be unable to be identified as anything else but excrement. And of course, in this state, it is devoid of any luster of a patriarchal society gives to the phallus, symbolic or otherwise. So what happened from there varies according to specialists of various disciplines. According to Tim Gearing of the Minneapolis Museum of Art, Isis made a phallus herself on the resurrected body of Osiris, well enough to conceive Horus, the falcon-headed heir to the kingdom. But according to Hani Rashwan, a scholar of ancient Egyptian literature and Arabic poetics, Isis had no need to reconstruct a penis. She instead created Osiris's sperm by magic and placed it into her own womb. This is explicitly stated in the original ancient Egyptian text, according to Rashwan. So regardless of the interpretation put forth, however, Isis was not only an important mother figure, but she had magical healing powers capable of restoring a phallus, or rather sperm, in some fashion. So even in a dissecting room where humans are reduced to a sum of separate body parts rendered useless without life, the superiority of the womb cannot be clear to Bahia, and it remains an important symbol throughout the novel. If one considers Isis as a model for an excellent mother, Bahia's own mother, if not both of her parents, fall short of the mark of excellence. So Bahia claims that she hates her father and in fact does not love her mother. Nonetheless, she somehow knew instinctively that her mother's body was the only thing that understood her. And she, quote, burned with desire to return where she had come from. That is, to her mother's womb. How was Bahia able to separate her mother as a living, breathing person from her uterus, this place where she so badly wanted to return, from the reality of life and society had forced her, where she so badly wanted to return before the reality of life and society had forced her to become two women in one? So Bahia's mother was one of the people who complicated her daughter's existence instead of freeing it, frequently reprimanding Bahia for the way she acted and even defiantly stood by raising one foot on an elevated edge of furniture or the like. Her mother demanded her to be more like other girls, quote, with tightly bound legs, a reference to them being circumcised, a practice that because of various circumstances, Bahia had been fortunate to escape. But like a betrayal, Bahia's mother wanted her to be like them. So speaking specifically about motherhood, Saadawi claims that it is the female who is uniquely capable of creating life through childbearing, but it is only the woman who has the, quote, mental ability to transform childbearing from a semi-mechanical biological process into physically, mentally, and emotionally creative work, end quote. It is her mother's failure to move beyond motherhood as a biological process that makes her unworthy of Bahia's love. In terms of her mother's physical body, it is only her mother's womb capable of creating or being creative, explaining Bahia's wish not to have been separated from it. It may also be according to such logic that Bahia claims that she did not consider Salim male. The first time she goes to be with Salim, the young man whom she had met at her university's art gallery where her work was on display, she claims that this chance meeting had shown her that she had not even been aware of herself as a female. So seeing Halim thus becomes an assertion of her freedom and choice and a discovery of her real self. So sex would no longer just be something done to her in a context that her family and society control. Making love to Salim is incapable of becoming mechanical sex. It is, as Saadawi writes, quote, a new pulse deep within her, like magical life born out of nothingness, as if a rock fixed firmly to a mountain suddenly moved and throbbed like a heartbeat, end quote. So with Salim, Bahia had exercised her sexual rights, as Shireen Al-Feki describes in her book, Sex and the Citadel, which is, quote, the right to choose your own partner and to be sexually active or not in a consensual relationships. The freedom to decide whether you want to have children and when, to control your own body, and the liberty to pursuing a satisfying, safe, and pleasurable sex life without coercion, discrimination, or violence, end quote. So Al-Feki's notion of sexual rights complements a similar idea expressed by Leila Slimani in Sex and Lives. In this work, Slimani confirms, quote, a woman whose body is subject to such severe social control cannot fully take her place as a citizen, end quote. So Bahia's relationship with Salim has also thus allowed her to fight alongside him for a freer Egyptian society. With Salim, Bahia's body now feels like a free spirit and weightless, but at the same time, and using these same words in the novel, strong enough to pierce iron and take bullets. So in Headscarves and Hymens, Mona El-Tahawi claims that for women, there have always been two revolutions. Quote, one fought with men against regimes that oppress everyone, and a second against the misogyny that pervades the region, end quote. So at the beginning of Saadawi's novel, the reader does not even suspect that Bahia has a rebellious spirit capable of fighting her freedom for all Egyptians. But once Bahia, through both her body and mind, claim her sexual rights, it is logical that she's able to join a revolution alongside her male peers. So throughout Saadawi's career as a writer and an activist, we see prominent themes bringing mind, body, creativity, and freedom together in a conversation about feminism as it pertains particularly to women in the Middle East. But her discussions also include analyses and harsh critique of so-called democratic systems that made conditions for those living in the global South, especially women, even more difficult. So as the field of medicine was one of Saadawi's first intellectual sources of reference, by choice or not, it is a discipline that remains central to her work. Her experience provided her the opportunity to treat both men and women, but she was especially moved by her work with women and children, especially in obstetrics, gynecology, and pediatrics, where she had been able to witness firsthand how reproductive diseases and malnutrition wreak havoc on the poorest of the poor. It was at this point that she discovered that there were aspects about the medical profession that disturbed her profoundly, and I'm quoting Nawal next. My interest in psychiatry and mental health was a direct result of experience as a woman observing and treating other women in rural and urban areas, of my increasing involvement in feminist studies, feminist writings, and women's problems, and of my increasing involvement too in struggle in Egypt and in the Arab world. It was not a bid to discover a lucrative career in a luxurious private clinic where I could climb the social ladder from the class that labors in order to live to a class that lives on the labor of others, end quote. So despite her criticism of the medical profession, Saadawi was unable to walk away from it entirely. Although Saadawi left the clinical side of medicine, her life's work remained very much about healing, even if she adopted different tools to do so. So in 2007, Saadawi contributed a preface to a collection of essays about Evelyn Akkad, a Lebanese feminist author who had, like Saadawi, written extensively about excision. But here Saadawi in the preface was also supporting Akkad's research critical of multinational drug companies and their tactics to promote and sell hormonal therapy, either as contraception or as a way of treating menopause as a disease. Already in her essay, Women in Health in the Arab World, Saadawi had warned that drug companies will continue to sell their wares to women, especially those in non-industrialized societies, even if they had to maim them or bleed them or even kill them, as Saadawi said. In both of these pieces, Saadawi cautioned readers not to consider hormonal treatments as replacements for development and women's emancipation. So to conclude, in Two Women in One, Saadawi chose to present, at the midpoint of her writing career, a protagonist that resembled her as an 18-year-old female medical student in 1950s Cairo. And despite the author's own wisdom gained after her years of experience, she is still able to capture the essence of Bahia Shaheen, torn between who she wants to be and what her family and society expect of her. Bahia is not nearly as articulate as we remember Nawal to have been herself, but this is intentional. It is Bahia's determination and the ultimate courage to confront her fears that stand out in a story that in many ways is as timely and pertinent today as it ever was. So despite an ending where Saadawi leaves us with an image of Bahia in handcuffs, we know that her young protagonist's mind is finally free. Thank you very much. Oh, I think you're on mute, Miriam.
Here I am. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Really interesting. And we will revisit your talk and everybody else's at the end of this panel.
Sure.
So our second panelist today is Ibrahim Sayed Fawzy, who comes to us from Fayoum, an oasis in Egypt, beautiful place. He holds an MA in English literature, participated in various international conferences and workshops, and published a number of articles and translations. He's also an English-Arabic literary translator. His first monograph is coming out later this year. His interests include contemporary Arabic literature, cultural studies, post-colonial studies, eco-criticism, as well as translation studies. So Ibrahim, welcome.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you for having me today in such a marvelous conference to share my thoughts on El Saadawi's prison experience. I will deal with El Saadawi as a political prisoner, and my paper is entitled On Docility and Corporeality, Female Bodies as Sites of Torture and Resistance in El Saadawi's Prison Memoir. Of course, among many other Egyptian intellectuals, El Saadawi was incarcerated for opposing President Anwar el-Sadat's economic and social policies. She was held in the famous Cairo prison, Al-Qanatir, until her imprisonment was cut short after el-Sadat's assassination in 1981. In her first-hand account of her incarceration and resistance to state violence that was published 4 months after her release, El Saadawi highlights her friendship, mental triumphs, ecstasy, and tactics of survival. El Saadawi's memoir is about the various forces of oppression injured by Arab female prisoners in particular. It manifests the power of control exerted by the government over the citizens and the consequent confiscation of citizens' liberties and rights, especially the right to express their views. El Saadawi, of course, condemns the authoritarian regime that puts the fates of millions of citizens in the hands of one person. So people are incarcerated and released on his orders. Her Memoirs from the Women's Prison is a classic political prison memoir because it has the conventional tripartite structure: the arrest, incarceration, and release. Memoirs from the Women's Prison begins with the moment of her arrest, when she was sitting in her flat writing a novel. The armed men broke into her flat without permission. Her resistance began when she refused to sit between the officer and the driver in the car, and she sat near the window. The scene of the very first scene of the arrest shows how a brave woman El Saadawi was. She was only terrified by ignorance, which for her meant death and fear. In prison, El Saadawi decided to live as if she was not going to live again. Ironically, she found herself free under duress. She expresses, and this is a quote, "I don't know the secret of that repose or the happiness which came over me all of a sudden. Perhaps it was the happiness of self-discovery, when there appears before one's eyes a new courage or self-confidence of which one was previously unaware, or when one disperses a fear or a phantom with which one has been living." The memoir includes various physical and mental survival tactics. Obviously, in the midst of extreme suffering under duress, El Saadawi crafted her aesthetic profile and the aesthetic she and her cellmates produced in their life behind the prison high walls to survive. El Saadawi attempted to write her memoir with aesthetics in mind to get out of psychologically traumatic zones. Inside prisons, as all of us know, time is psychologically interpreted. Inside prisons, time expands and space shrinks. El Saadawi observes that, saying, "Time is no longer time. Time and the wall have merged into one. The air is motionless. Nothing moves around me except the cockroaches and rats as I lie on a thin rubber mattress, which gives off the odor of old urine. My empty handbag placed under my head." Waiting, of course, annoyed her and turned meaning into meaningless and time into timelessness. So El Saadawi attempted to shorten her time through mental journeys and labor. She got the chance to plant vegetables and enjoy digging as well as gardening. So her mood was lifted and she started to remember her childhood. She says, "I forgot that I was in prison." El Saadawi's memoir embodies the multifaceted outlook of resistance culture. She shows how she applied passive resistance, self-actualization, and collective rights. Furthermore, political prisoners use farce as a mechanism of resistance, perform skits and sing songs. In conformity with Bakhtin's argument that laughter demolishes fear and before an object, Adorni Portela confirms that political prisoners use Black humor to resist their oppressive situation. Black humor clearly shows the disability of prison authority to fully crush the prisoner's identity, since the prisoners use it so as to transfer the direst circumstances into an imagined space in which they can experience ecstatic moments. Certainly, prison authority is powerless against that natural desire to have fun. El Saadawi narrates that she experienced the paradoxical feelings of grief and joy behind the prison high walls. She says, in prison, I came to know both extremes together. I experienced the height of joy and grief, the peaks of pain and pleasure, the greatest beauty and the most intense ugliness. At certain moments, I imagined that I was living a new love story. In prison, I found my heart open to love. Of course, writing about the prison experience is regarded a great threat to the stability of despotic regimes. El Saadawi narrates that the prison authorities rejected the her request for pen and paper, claiming that it was easier to give her a pistol than pen and paper. She was shocked by this line from Fars and said, I had not imagined that pen and paper could be more dangerous than pistols in the world of reality and fact. Although the prison authorities initially denied the prisoners access to pen and paper, the authorities granted El Saadawi and her cellmates pens and paper to ask their families to bring them clothes. But El Saadawi did not surrender and secretly managed to write her diaries on toilet rolls and cigarette papers. At midnight, while she was sitting on top of the overtuned bottom of the jerry can. Interestingly, El Saadawi exploited the advantages related to her gender as a female political prisoner, as well as the quite lax surveillance of Connaught prison. She hid her diaries inside her rollers and packed them in her suitcase and smuggled them safely upon her release. Undoubtedly, El Saadawi was filled with ecstasy and merriment when she hid in a corner to write her secret diaries while others were sleeping. El Saadawi's feeling of happiness was derived from a temporary sense that her mind was free even if her body was not. Additionally, it might have been derived from overcoming this merriment, this happiness might have derived from overcoming obstacles and creating aesthetic pleasure through accomplishing something meaningful. Female prisoners formed an alliance to demand better conditions and to maintain their sanity in the confines of their narrow cells. Female prisoners were divided into political prisoners who can be defined as those incarcerated due to their active or passive involvement in political activities, as well as prisoners of conscience associated with non-political activities, such as religious practices. And criminal prisoners, including murderers and beggars. El Saadawi narrates the stories of criminal female prisoners to unveil the socio-economic and political structure of Egypt during El Sadat's era. For example, Fathiya's crime was murdering her husband who had raped her daughter. Fathiya and many others were the victims of the patriarchal society. El Saadawi used her imprisonment as a chance to pursue feminist leadership. So she proudly demonstrated solidarity and identified with her outcast companions as much as she did with her fellow political prisoners. During incarceration, El Saadawi preserved her own dignity and integrity. She describes the contentment derived from establishing harmonious relationships and solidarity among female prisoners. Female prisoners managed to press the prison authorities to meet their demands. So when one of the prisoners got ill, the others did her tasks and demanded that she should be seen by a doctor. Notwithstanding the stagnation of prison, prisoners are not to be stagnant in the cramped cell. In the cramped cell, El Saadawi and her cellmates could carve their small space where they expressed various forms of resistance. Budur, for example, combed the hair of the shawisha so as to know what was happening in prison. El Saadawi narrates how she kept her body and mind sound by doing daily exercise. She could sing a song while taking a shower for the first time since her detention. Furthermore, she narrates poetically her emotional response to befriending a young girl. She says, happiness, like infection, spreads rapidly. I felt that I too had become a child. My heart filled with pleasure. The pains in my back disappeared and my body felt strong and energetic. I went to the steel bar door. The dawn breeze massaged my face with invigorating moisture. The sky was still black, but the early light was creeping in slowly. Of course, El Saadawi was arrested for overstepping her stereotypical limits as a woman. Her resistance to the authorities' attempts to define her by imprisoning her was physical. Since she exercised her body, that was her precious object, her autonomy, and her safe space. She says, any organized group movement, even if it be merely bodily exercise or dancing, establishes a rhythm in the mind and body, which resembles the pattern of revolution. Hence, El Saadawi, as well as her cellmates who joined in the ecstatic amalgamation of healthy exercise, as well as political protest, denied the state's power over the body, a power that is, as argued by Foucault, essential to incarceration. El Saadawi fits the unruly woman as described by Caroline Faith. She was denied, she was undisciplined, defiant, offensive, and unmanageable. She defied the state's oppression with writing and exercise. Scary also points out that the expressibility of pain opposes the political outcomes of the previous inexpressibility. After her release from prison, Nawal El Saadawi was exiled and received many assassination threats. She, however, engaged in many public talks in the United States to talk about oppression at home. When she returned home, she declared that she would stand for the 2005 presidential elections against the late President Hosni Mubarak, who was in power for 24 years then. Despite her early withdrawal from the elections, her declared intention was to motivate the Egyptians to call for constitutional amendments that allow for several candidacies for the presidency. And I think I have to end my presentation with this, that Nawal withdrawal from elections to, although she withdrew from elections early, but she intended to motivate the Egyptians. And this can be found throughout her writings. Nawal wanted to motivate all of us to change whatever we can change. I think that's enough, and thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Very, very interesting, and such a wonderful reminder of this charismatic, inspirational woman. So our next speaker is Asmaa Mansour. Asmaa Mansour is a bilingual scholar and postdoctoral fellow at Tulane University in Middle East and North Africa. Prior to coming to Tulane, Dr. Mansour received her PhD in English from the University of Texas at San Antonio last year. Her forthcoming book project, entitled Toward a Chicana Decolonial Reading of Autobiographical Writings by Egyptian Women, 1950s to the Present, constitutes the first decolonial reading of Arabic literature and Arabic autobiography, and fills a significant gap in research that deals with Chicana Arab coalitional politics. Dr. Mansour is deeply invested in interdisciplinary research that investigates the intersection between race, class, gender, and religion, as well as transdisciplinary research in the Arab world, Latin America, Africa, and the United States. Asmaa, please.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's just a pleasure to be with you today. So my paper is entitled Toward an Arab Woman, Conocimiento, a psychosexual political approach to Memoirs of a Woman Doctor and Walking Through Fire. And it's actually based on one of the chapters of my book. So in this paper, or in this talk, I aim to expand the possibility for establishing what I call an Arab woman conocimiento. And by an Arab woman conocimiento, I mean a psychological, sexual, political consciousness that entails seeing through the interlocking systems of oppression, including coloniality, patriarchy, and capitalism, linking scattered information, and fighting against the dismemberment of women's bodies and the fragmentation of their psyches. Memoirs of a Woman Doctor, published in 1957, highlights the stages of consciousness of an unnamed first-person woman narrator who becomes a physician in 1950s Egypt, and in so doing, struggles for gender equality and social justice. In her mind, this woman, likely a portrait of El Saadawi herself, learns to unlearn what the society and her family taught her, to cover her body parts, because everything in her was shameful, to feel biologically and physically inferior to her brother, to make gods of men, and to suppress her female sexuality as a beautiful woman, all to be able to function in a classist, sexist society, or in the prestigious but male-dominated field, medical field. El Saadawi reaches consciousness after going through a painful process of unlearning oppression, making meaning of her painful experience, and becoming conscious that in the world of medicine, physiology and psychology should not be separated. With this knowledge in mind, she ultimately helps men and women, patients and citizens, to deconstruct binaries like body and psyche, men and women. In a much later work, Walking Through Fire, published in 2002, El Saadawi resolves this inner psychological conflict through preventive medicine, through raising a consciousness about the interlink between the psychological, the sexual, and the political, and through what she calls unveiling of the people's minds. Indeed, unveiling of the mind concept is absent in scholarship on El Saadawi's works, yet this concept, I claim, has to a large extent informed El Saadawi's feminism and all her writings, interviews, and essays. I understand unveiling of the mind as a decolonial strategy for raising people's awareness and sharing information about the interplay between the psychological, the sexual, and the political, between patriarchy, capitalism, and coloniality, and between individual consciousness and collective consciousness. In this way, unveiling of the mind is akin to what Anzaldúa calls conocimiento. By the aid of Anzaldúa's Conocimiento, the theory, I draw critical attention to unveiling of the mind and reconstruct the concept as a productive framework that will ultimately lead to cross-cultural solidarity and mutual awareness that both women, that both El Saadawi and Anzaldúa have reiterated in their writings. Since El Saadawi's name and works in the West have always been associated with Arab women's oppression under Islam, my analysis of Memoirs of a Woman Doctor and Walking Through Fire dismantles this assumption and dismantles also the West's knowledge production about Arab women. I argue that both works are not simply concerned with Arab women's sexuality or female body, but with seeing through and resisting the psychosexual political oppressions imposed on both men and women, and with enlightening one's mind and others through enhanced consciousness and consciousness raising. So what is El Saadawi's unveiling of the mind? And for the sake of time, of course, I'm summarizing this. It is a term she coined in 1982 as a slogan for one of the objectives of the Arab Women's Solidarity Association that also aimed at gaining political power through unity and solidarity. Unveiling of the mind, or رفع الحجاب عن العقل, literally means in Arabic, removing the hijab, the cover, from the mind. The term might have been problematic, as I claim, both to Western and Arab critics, since it can insinuate prejudice against the hijab, the Islamic religious dress, hence further oppressing Muslim women, especially those who choose to wear it in the West. El Saadawi, for instance, is accused of heresy, especially when she says that the slogan of her association is unveiling of the mind. Surprisingly, people responded to this slogan by claiming that the veil is sacred and that she is inciting women to disobey Allah. Yet I'm convinced that El Saadawi is conscious of the confusion this term creates, and she uses the term intentionally to inspire women to think, though she's of course not supportive of the hijab, which for her is no different from cosmetics or plastic surgery or nudity and consumerism. But however, she writes that the veil of the mind is more dangerous than a piece of cloth. This phrase ultimately means that a Muslim woman can only put a veil or hijab only if she is educated, if she rejects consumerism, and if she is not under political pressure to wear it. However, the term remains loaded with negative connotations, though its definition suggests otherwise. More specifically, El Saadawi defines the term unveiling of the mind in the essential Nawal El Saadawi reader as a new knowledge or a new consciousness. It is a rebellion against ignorance, a submission, and injustice. To unveil our minds, El Saadawi provides us with a medical prescription in which we have to fight against the destruction of the mind and the nurturing of false consciousness built on scattered, de-linked information, especially because the creation of a false consciousness among women makes them more amenable to submission and male desire. Now I want to draw your attention to the term Conocimiento. The term Conocimiento was first fully explained by Anzaldúa in her 2002 article, Now Let Us Shift, and where Anzaldúa describes the 7 stages or the development of a woman's psyche to reach Conocimiento. Yet Anzaldúa also provides various definitions of the term in Borderlands La Frontera and in a number of articles and interviews. According to Anzaldúa, Conocimiento is a counter-knowledge or subversive awareness that defies colonial hierarchical linear knowledge. It is also seeing through internalized oppression, through whiteness, and through constructed biased information. Skeptical of reason and rationality, Conocimiento is a spiritual inquiry that questions conventional knowledge and dominant ideologies. Although Conocimiento seems to be an inner psychological work, it is in fact a public act for social transformation. It advocates sharing information, knowledge, insights, and resources with other groups. Accordingly, solidarity and collective transformation can be actualized. To develop psychologically or reach Conocimiento, according to Anzaldúa in Now Let Us Shift, you have to pass through 7 stages that can be summarized as: first, you feel that there is something not right and you are overwhelmed with fear after you experience a physical crisis that forces you to build emotional walls between yourself and people. Second, you live in the pantala, the in-between space or the zone of contradictions where you experience reality as fluid and you are open to other perspectives and you try to find something meaningful or a mindful, holistic awareness. Third, you descend into despair and self-loathing and hopelessness. Fourth, you break from your habitual coping strategies of escaping from the realities you are reluctant to face, reconnect with the spirit and undergo conversion. Fifth, you create a new narrative or a new description of your reality. Sixth, you take your story into the world, testing it while feeling angry with yourself and others. Seventh, you develop an ethical, compassionate strategy with which to negotiate conflict and difference within self and between others. These stages for Anzaldúa can occur concurrently, chronologically or not, and they are all valuable mental spaces where learning and self-understanding can occur. So I have talked enough about my theoretical framework, and I hope by now you see how El Saadawi's unveiling of the mind is reminiscent of Anzaldua's Conocimiento. And I'm sure now you are ready for my analysis. In Memoirs of a Woman Doctor, all these stages of Conocimiento happened in El Saadawi's or the narrator's psyche, non-chronologically. The narrator as a kid wept over her femininity even before she knew what it was, because her mother treated her differently compared to her brother. El Saadawi realizes that there is something not right about gender difference. She experiences what Anzaldua calls a physical crisis and begins to hate her femininity. After reaching the age of menstruation, she begins to feel unclean and tries to hide her big breasts so that everyone seems to notice. And what has exacerbated her female experience is that she has been sexually harassed by the doorman. Overwhelmed by despair and self-loathing, the narrator decides not to tell her mother about this harassment. The narrator's Conocimiento begins with escaping from the harsh reality of gender contradictions and with trying to make meaning of her pain by imagining that she is a goddess and that men are helpless creatures. She cuts her hair as a protest or as a way to prove to her family that she could do everything her brother did and her father did. She joins the School of Medicine because it inspired respect, even veneration in her family. Only at the dissecting room does the narrator become aware that there is no essential difference between a man and a woman. El Saadawi observes that a woman contained a man inside her and a man concealed a woman in his depth. A woman had male organs, some apparent and some hidden, and a woman had male organs, some apparent and some hidden, and a man had female hormones in his blood. Seeing a naked man lying down on the dissecting table, El Saadawi comes to the realization that there is nothing sacred or godly about men as her mother taught her, except that he was an assortment of muscles, arteries, nerves, and bones. Conversely, El Saadawi's narrator's partial mindful awareness, to borrow Anzaldua's words, in the dissecting room has been short-lived. She descends into despair again when she realizes that she has to suppress her female sexuality to function in the male-dominated field of medicine. Moreover, she becomes skeptical of science once she has failed to help a pregnant mother who has died while giving birth to a child. This is the moment when the narrator realizes how fragmented medicine is, especially because she has been taught by her professors to see the human body, whether dead or living, as nothing but a jumble of organs, dismembered limbs, or loose assemblage of discrete parts. Still skeptical of this kind of reasoning or knowledge and still unable to create a new understanding of masculinity and femininity, the narrator's consciousness, however, widened out from masculinity and femininity to embrace the humankind as a whole. The narrator tries to negotiate the conflict within herself, to borrow Anzaldua's words, and adopts an ethical, compassionate strategy that encompasses men and women simply because we are all vulnerable to diseases and small viruses that can devour the body. Moreover, instead of submitting herself to anxiety and depression, the narrator transforms her inner psychological pain into a public transformative act. El Saadawi writes, "I've decided to do the battle, to drown in my own sweat, to face the society on the feet of iron." Accordingly, she saves a psychologically distressed teenage girl who comes to her clinic asking for help, otherwise she will become a victim to what so-called an honor crime. Although the narrator never mentions how she saves the girl, she most probably has helped her do a hymen reconstruction surgery or abortion. Because she refuses to delink the psychological, the sexual from the political oppression imposed on women, the narrator raises our awareness to the unjust politics that criminalize abortion and idealize a woman's hymen or virginity. Importantly, in her surgical clinic that functions as a microsome of the society, the narrator again develops ethical compassion to all human beings, men and women, after she listens to their testimonies and tragedies, or after becoming conscious that they were both wrongdoers and victims of wrongdoing. Put differently, these patients for the narrators are all victims to desconocimiento, the opposite of Anzaldua's conocimiento. This conocimiento, as Anzaldúa defines it, is the repressed, the hatred, and the ignorance triggered by coloniality, capitalism, and patriarchy. Now I move on to discuss El Saadawi's Walking Through Fire. Unlike Memoirs of a Woman Doctor, El Saadawi's main concern in Walking Through Fire is not reaching conocimiento through the 7 stages, but is fighting against the desconocimiento that stems from delinking of information or knowledge, particularly delinking capitalism from patriarchy and from coloniality. For instance, a larger section of Walking Through Fire is devoted to dismantling the colonized patriarchal Egyptian education system, especially education in the School of Medicine in the 1950s. According to El Saadawi, students in medical schools learn to memorize everything, spell them out in exams, and forget about them. Additionally, the School of Medicine graduates doctors who are ignorant of the female body. El Saadawi illustrates that doctors' ignorance about the hymen or the clitoris is in fact not exclusive to the village where she grew up. It is steeped in the post-colonial Egyptian education system since the 1950s, if not until today. She notes, "We were taught nothing about the unhealthy and often dangerous habits and rituals practiced in both rural and urban areas, including circumcision. When I graduated as a medical doctor, I knew nothing about the hymen or the clitoris and the village barbers who made money out of them." Evidently, Egyptians, as El Saadawi clarifies, inherited the system of medical education from the era of the British colonial rule, and thanks to modernity, students are taught in English and graduate knowing almost nothing about the body as a whole. To transform her conocimiento into action, El Saadawi, as she tells us in Walking Through Fire, taught herself to see the human body as a whole, to see the society as a whole, and to see knowledge as a whole. Here, El Saadawi, again, like in Memoirs of a Woman Doctor, raises our awareness that with fragmented knowledge, no individual or collective transformation can happen. More importantly, like in Memoirs of a Woman Doctor, in which the narrator struggles to take money from patients because medicine for her wasn't a commodity and the success wasn't to be measured in terms of money and fame. El Saadawi proposes in Walking Through Fire that the medical field can be disentangled from patriarchy through prioritizing women's health and purified from capitalism through promoting preventive medicine. To conclude, through analyzing Memoirs of a Woman Doctor and Walking Through Fire, I have demonstrated how Conocimiento can provide critics with tools to analyze Arab women's writings that focus on the intersection between the sexual, political, and the psychological. Conocimiento, in my view, can also provide our Arab women writers with the tools to write and make meaning of their experience. Conocimiento is a decolonial psychosexual political theory that accentuates counter knowledge and utilizes consciousness raising as a political and a feminist tool. My goal in this paper or in this talk, as I've mentioned earlier, is to open the door towards a more critical attention to El Saadawi's unveiling of the mind, which can be defined as the opposite of what El Saadawi also calls in a number of interviews as psychological circumcision or mental circumcision, which again is reminiscent of Anzaldúa's Desconocimiento. However, I claim that the term unveiling of the mind, though a productive term, mistakenly suggests that awareness can be done by only one action, by removing the veil from our minds. But in fact, we need to keep doing or decolonizing our minds, put unveiling of the mind concept in dialogue with women of color, the feminist consciousness in the US, especially with Anzaldúa's Conocimiento, and contextualize unveiling of the mind within El Saadawi's Arab feminist thought at large. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Asmaa. So you have followed on what Hind said yesterday, and that is yet another new way to read Nawal's work. We will come back to that later. And last but not least, Suja Sawafta, who is currently an assistant professor and director of Arabic studies in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at the University of Miami. Her research focuses on exile and eco-criticism in modern Arabic and Franco-Arab literature across the Mediterranean and the global South. She's currently at work on her first book project, which examines the impact of exile, intellectual commitment, and political dissent in the works of the formative Saudi-Iraqi novelist and petroleum economist Abdurrahman Munif. Her research, writing, and advocacy work centers on the notions of land and indigeneity. My goodness me, indigeneity, I do speak English, across both existential, political, as well as environmental, ecological planes, seeing land as a basis for nourishment, freedom, and equality for all of humankind. Suja, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me, and also just want to express my gratitude for being last, because these wonderful presentations we've had today will fill in any gaps in my own presentation. So my paper, what I've adapted today from a journal article I'm working on, is Saadawi and Fanon towards a medical ethics of socio-political liberation. And I would like to start the paper by giving a little bit of context as to how I got here. So a mere few weeks after Nawal El Saadawi's passing last spring, I was invited by the Gender and Sexuality Studies Colloquium at the University of Miami to give a talk on a feminist icon of my choosing. At the time of this request, the literary universe I had so often took refuge in and found hope in was shape-shifting. Saadawi's loss had come a month after the passing of the Palestinian poet Murid al-Barghouti, and while the cacophony of lamentations across the Arab cultural sphere generally acknowledged the loss of two giants, of both giants, Barghouti's departure was romanticized because many had found cause to celebrate his heavenly reunion with his wife and fellow writer Radwa Ashur. Saadawi, on the other hand, and as many of my fellow presenters have already noted, ignited a social uprising even in her death. The sentiments and eulogies seem to exist across a polarity. She was hailed by some as a goddess of the Nile, a feminist icon of incomparable proportions and a nearly unrivaled status, or, by contrast, was criticized by her detractors for her staunch and unshakable commitment to the liberation of women, particularly those who found themselves at the mercy of the machinations of the societal underbelly with no one to fight for them. I knew that my lecture for the colloquium had to be about Nawal as a woman of point zero who represented and fought for women at point zero. And in the Q&A, a colleague asked the following question: would Nawal El Saadawi have considered herself as working within the same tradition as Frantz Fanon, given that they are both psychiatrists that were driven to writing through encounters with patients in the medical profession? My first instinct was to consider, albeit briefly, why I myself hadn't thought to make that connection as a Franco-Arabist who had studied and taught both writers for years. But my second was to answer her by saying, I honestly do not know if Saadawi herself would have seen her work as working within the same tradition as Fanon, but there are many reasons as to why that would be a valid connection to make, and I will try to reflect on this further. And here we are at this serendipitous conference a year later, where I tried to make sense of some of those thoughts. So I will start with the woman of the hour, with what I do know for certain. Throughout her decades-long career, Saadawi achieved unparalleled status as the Arab world's foremost feminist intellectual writer. The genesis of her origin story, her intellectual origin story, begins with her upbringing in a paradoxical household. The daughter of somewhat progressive parents, she was encouraged to pursue her education to the highest degree. Yet, she was also a victim of female genital mutilation as a young girl. Barely into the double digits in age, her father encouraged her, and I say this lightly, to marry at the age of 10, a proposal that she refused. Such notes are essential to understanding her notable pursuits thereafter, particularly in the congruent fields of medicine and literature, which simultaneously illuminated the aftermath of her own personal traumas as a young girl and later as a young woman. A trauma that cultivated in part her specific brand of socio-political commitment, one that advocated for the comprehensive dismantling of culturally upheld patriarchal structures and the emancipation of women through a practice of medical ethics and humanism. For Saadawi, there are many truths at the core of this fight, the primary one being the pillar of her personal philosophy, or at least how I perceive it to be, is that a society that targets and villainizes women is not just harmful to women, it is harmful to everyone. This was not a declaration that Saadawi made simply to elicit a reaction from the social sphere, as she was often accused of doing, at least not fully. Her ethos was backed up by scientific fact. In the years following her graduation from the medical school at Cairo University in 1955, she encountered hundreds of women plagued by trauma, among other mental disorders. And through her interviews with these patients, she found a common pathology among them. They were victims of patriarchal oppression, gender violence, class oppression, and colonialism, among other things. Yet what is striking here is that these malignant traits were not part of a constellation of social diseases that existed as random and isolated causes for mental and physical abuse and decline. Rather, they were part of a network of interconnected oppressions, informing and bleeding into one another as comorbidities afflicting and infecting the connected tissue of society. Colonialism, perhaps, is the almighty disease as a whole, impacts society as a whole, limiting mobility and access to basic human rights, which then drives the oppressed to scramble for any sense of control or power among themselves, often through class division and gendered violence. It was clear here that women were made to pay for this more than anyone else. This notion was proven time and again, not only through Saadawi's medical practice, but it was reinforced in her literary works. In Saadawi's oeuvre, pathology and narratology collude and fuse to create a new manifesto, which was delivered through the vehicle of her fictional and non-fictional writing. Merely 3 years after her medical school graduation, Saadawi published her first novel in 1957-1958, a love letter to her patients of sorts, Mudhakkirat Tabiba, or Memoirs of a Woman Doctor, which was later translated into English and published by Zaki Books in 1988, so 30 years later. Memoirs of a Woman Doctor is a Bildungsroman of sorts. It chronicles the story of a young woman rebelling against both family and society by studying medicine. And it is through this struggle that she fully understands herself and her desires, but also her conceptualization of society, which proves to be unfulfilling and limiting on the basis of sex. While Saadawi's main bone to pick was primarily with gender politics and the patriarchy, it bears substantial likeness to the experiences and conclusions made by her fellow psychiatrist and writer, the Martinique-born French-educated turned honorary Algerian Frantz Fanon. If we were to substitute sex with race, what Fanon faced in France by way of Orientalism and racial divisions is nearly identical to the trials and tribulations that Saadawi faced in her own life by way of class and patriarchy. What she encountered in her practice of medicine and subsequently wrote about in her literary works is comparable to what Fanon experienced. But in Fanon's case, he enjoyed the social privilege of being a man, but faced much by way of alienation for his Blackness. In the same manner that Saadawi produced Memoirs of a Woman Doctor 3 years after finishing her medical training in Cairo, Fanon likewise wrote and published his first book, Peau Noire, Masque Blanche, Black Skin, White Masks, in 1952, whilst he was still a medical resident. Black Skin, White Masks was first and foremost an analysis of the psychological effects of colonial subjugation on Black people and brown people by extension. It demonstrated how alienation was the root aim of the colonial power upon the colonized subject, and most importantly, the impossibility of cultural assimilation into a cultural sphere that was deliberately designed to maintain and sustain colonial supremacy. Fanon's was a cautionary tale, which used the psychiatric findings and the psychology of abuse to warn Black and brown people of the dangers of buying into this myth. And to quote Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Cultural assimilation is not possible in such a social structure. The white mask that hides Black skin is nothing more than just a mask. While Fanon's first book is now considered Among the essential readings of post-colonial decolonial studies, one must revisit and remember that the publication of the book itself came after PhD examiners at the University of Lyon rejected Fanon's first iteration of the book, a doctoral dissertation titled Essay on the Disalienation of the Black, which incidentally was born out of his personal experience of maltreatment, racism, and alienation during his pursuit of medicine at the university. In this way, Fanon and Saadawi share the common experiences of being impacted not just by personal traumas of racism, violence, and FGM in the case of Saadawi, but also their personal experiences were compounded by continuous encounters with medical patients throughout their careers. I return here to Saadawi and her encounter with Firdaus, the ill-fated heroine of Woman at Point Zero. The literary character of Firdaus is based on a real woman of the same name whom Saadawi met while working with female prisoners at the Qanatit prison, ironically the same prison that Nawal herself would be incarcerated in. And through this novel, Saadawi narrativizes a firsthand account of Firdaus's experiences, chronicling the series of unfortunate events which led to the latter's imprisonment and subsequent execution in the 1970s. Firdaus fell victim to parental abuse, and her first sexual experiences happened to her while she was just a child and was unaware of what it was that was actually physically happening to her. She was also likewise a victim of FGM and later fled a forced marriage only to become homeless. Firdaus was also trafficked into prostitution not once, but twice. And through her pimps, we see that even in sex work, she faced two stark experiences and that were varying as a quote, low-class prostitute under Fayoum's control or a high-class escort under Sharifa's supervision. Despite the difference in comfort, cleanliness, and some choice that she found while working for Sharifa, as opposed to the dirt and desolation that so clearly marked Fayoum's residence, it is not lost on the reader that Sharifa was as much a gatekeeper of the patriarchy and its oppression as Fayoum was, if not more so than him. This "if you can't beat them, join them" mentality and its stark contrast to Firdaus's suffering cements the reader's sympathy firmly to align with Firdaus and her alone. We begin to see that not a single character in this novel extends any courtesy to Firdaus without it being contingent upon them extracting as much as possible from her in return. There is no kindness in sight, not even when she attempts to leave sex work for a government job and falls in love with her coworker who, despite leading her on and soaking up in the warmth of her love, gets engaged to another woman, which propels her back into her previous work. The experiences of Firdaus, the literary character, are aestheticized and relate to us through El Saadawi, immortalized in a novel that we can read from the comfort of our own home. One must imagine that the visceral reality of these experiences, the trauma of it all, what Firdaus, the woman, experienced was much worse. It was real and raw and unforgiving. One of the ways the reader can conceptualize this is through El Saadawi's narrativization of Firdaus's psychosis at varying points throughout the narrative, often after moments of intense disappointment, physical harm, violence, rape, and emotional distress. Firdaus begins to see and she begins to hallucinate and see an eye that pulses in and out of her line of vision, and it sucks her in like a vortex. But this is about the only thing really that by way of psychosis or kind of the way that her neurosis manifests that she experiences, everything else is very much emotional blunting, which I'll return to again at the end. Saadawi's consideration of neurosis, which led her to the Qanatit prison in the first place, is likewise replicated to comparable capacity in Fanon's Les Damnés de la Terre, The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961, in response to the Algerian War for Independence from France. In this work, Fanon considers many things about the colonial order, including but not limited to the role of natives, the lumpen proletariat, workers, and intellectuals, all collectively, in advancing the cause of national liberation, Wherein in Saadawi's findings and vision, we see a proposal for the dismantling of colonial class and patriarchal structure for the freedom of all facets of society. In Fanon, it is people like Firdaus who are the most important, those doomed to live within the underbelly, those with nothing to lose by way of privilege. They are the ones who can advance the cause for social change and liberation more than any other person. It is those who are accustomed to the mercilessness of society's chaos and injustices who perhaps can wield organized chaos as a superpower. While the first 4 chapters of The Wretched of the Earth clearly provide a manifesto and roadmap to liberation, the most striking of them being the need for violence to dismantle colonialism and by extension political and social systems born out of and maintained by extreme violence. It is in his last chapter, Colonial War and Mental Disorders, which so clearly demonstrates the trauma and damage that result on both sides of the colonial enterprise, its gatekeepers and its victims, and what is at stake should the modus operandi continue. And here, Fanon summarizes several case studies of encounters with patients throughout his time working as a psychiatrist in an Algerian hospital during the war. And I'm going to break away from script so I can summarize some of these cases and also relate them back to Nawal El Saadawi. So I have noted 4 different cases that Fanon kind of outlines among many in this 5th section, which kind of is he kind of acknowledges as an appendix. It doesn't really fit within the Liberation Manifesto that comes before it. But perhaps the most striking is the trauma work he did with military and police officers who were agents of the French state, and they became forever altered by their training and the guilt they felt from the torture they imposed on others. He describes them as being triggered by even the most simple pushback from their wives, from their children, because they were unable to cope with the psychological aftermath of what they inflicted on others. And they said, almost everyone he interviewed said to him, I could walk by a prison cell and know what point of torture the victim was in based on the confessions that were being generated. We know enough about torture and trauma theory to know that the main objective was to generate a confession, irrespective of the veracity of that confession. And so based on certain cries that he would hear coming from the cells, he knew what day and what position and what form of torture was being used against these prisoners. The second is the debilitation of an Algerian man whose wife was raped by French troops because she refused to out the position of the resistance and where the guerrilla training was taking place, and he felt guilt because he didn't love her. He married her as a second choice, and yet she gave up this ultimate sacrifice to protect him. And so basically he becomes emasculated because he couldn't protect his wife, and has a series of panic attacks and lack of kind of purpose in his life because he's unable to cope. The third example is a group of Algerian boys who were under the age of 10 who murdered their French playmate because they were engulfed into the vortex of colonial violence during the war. They didn't really know why they did it. They just said, well, we heard people saying this, so we said, okay, we'll do our part. And it kind of highlights the chaos of that violence. And the third, which I think is probably the most comparable to what Saadawi does at various points in her literary works, is the case of an Algerian man who suffered from PTSD and suicidal ideation after he killed the wife of a French colonial officer and kept hallucinating and seeing all the women he loved as dismembered, headless, decapitated, and rivers of blood flowing into a room. This reminds me so much of the psychosis that many of Saadawi's oppressed female protagonists experience throughout the novel. And I would like to borrow Professor Cooke's example of the play on Eyes, where the woman in question started having delusions about this figurine, and she starts seeing him in the street. So these comparable examples where she aestheticizes what Fanon essentially summarizes as case studies. So we see it in the form of the novel, we see it in the form of a literary character, and as a reader, it positions us somewhat in a different way to engage with that material. My final point, and whatever I didn't get to, I'm happy to answer in any Q&A, but my final point that I would be remiss not to mention is that specifically among scholars of Afropean and Caribbean studies, much of the criticism against Fanon was that he did not consider the question of gender enough. and that while he saw the Algerian woman as a very capable agent of society, of social and revolutionary change, he did not see his own compatriots in Martinique and across the Caribbean in the same light. And I know some scholars have been writing about that in more detail to kind of expose some of the dearth and nuance in that regard. But even so, even within the Algerian context, he failed to really consider gender. And that's probably where Asad Jabar's work can come in and kind of illuminate those shortcomings. And second, my final point is that I see their work in psychiatry as something that is foundational to our understanding of what is necessary and what is at stake if we do not consider their findings in the path towards national liberation movements, in the path towards social emancipation. And for those who criticize Saadawi for not staying in her lane, for lack of a better word, I don't see how what she did is any different than many of the male intellectuals of her generation who were hired as technocrats in their governments. They weren't necessarily trained in politics, they were trained in everything but politics, and yet they were afforded the privileged position of providing their opinion based on their discipline as technocrats to these governments. And we know that she did that, but it came with a lot of risk, and she was exiled afterwards. But it's ironic to me that she was not afforded the same respect as many of her colleagues and compatriots of that generation who were male. And so I think if these works were published today, as opposed to at the time that they were published, and they would perhaps be seen as a groundbreaking intervention, and that the use of psychiatry here would be extremely valid, whereas perhaps at the time that these were published, it wasn't considered in the same light. But we know that has changed, and perhaps that explains the afterlives of both of these works. Thank you.
Thank you, Suja. A wonderful presentation and very convincing comparison between these two extraordinary scholars, activists, doctors, saints. I will quickly make a couple of points, and then I'd like to invite the participants to start a discussion, maybe ask each other questions. And for those of you who are in the audience, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box. So, my goodness, each paper today was so exciting and interesting that I won't be able to get to each one, nor do I think that would be appropriate now. I'd like to do, I guess, what Hind did yesterday, and that is to bring together maybe some of the themes. And what came out of these papers today, more so than yesterday, because of the topic, was the way in which Nawal rejected binaries, was provocatively contemptuous of the ways in which the world in which we live is shaped by a binary epistemology. You know, there are men and then there are women. And then, of course, in Cheryl's presentation, so men and women, if we're going to look at that which is supposed to define the difference, right? The penis and the uterus. Well, in that story, they're both wrinkled. And they're both, even if the pear is the symbol of fertility and the excrement, the symbol of masculinity, they're both shriveled, and neither indicates a radical difference, except that they're both in their attempt to identify the binary, are shriveled. So this, what you brought up, Cheryl, and let me just quickly say, we're all calling each other by our first names because we have referred to Nawal. I think nobody has
No problem.
to Nawal as El Saadawi. So we're all on first name terms. So what you brought up, Cheryl, as the her contemptuous dismissal of that of the binarizing of sex and gender, we then see, of course, in Ibrahim's excuse me, presentation also the breakdown of the binary of freedom and liberation, so that there isn't freedom on one side and then imprisonment on the other, but that these binaries are so entangled in each other that in the space of prison, and Ibrahim, there's a nice expression, which I'm sure you know, that a lot of prison writers use, la makan wa la zaman. So no place, no time. So that once you're in there, in the space of nothingness, this Sartrean nothingness and being that was brought up by Asmaa, there is the absolute impossibility of disentangling freedom and imprisonment. So in everything that we have heard, and this goes back to yesterday and also goes back to Muhammad's presentation on the impossibility of disentangling genre. So we have in those silences that he was pointing out yesterday, we have the, again, entanglement of what is considered to be narratologically impossible to separate, the entanglement of theory and activism, again, something that I think she was ahead of her time, because people very often would say, oh no, she is not a theorist, she doesn't theorize, but of course she was. And in her theorizing, she was an activist. So it's in those poetic silences that a number of you have talked about that we have her way of weaving together what have been considered to be binaries. And then in Suja's discussion of the comparison between Fanon and Nawal, we have what, for those of us who knew her, I heard the echo of her class, colonialism, patriarchy. I mean, that for her, that was not 3 words, it was 1. And so you could not say, well, it's colonialism. You can't say it's patriarchy. You can't say it's class. It's all 3. So again, back to her intersectionality avant la lettre. And importantly, of course, again, in Suja's presentation, you talk about women, Sharifa, being a guardian of patriarchy. Women and men can't be separated because of their sex organs. And of course, I guess we all know that the clitoris is merely, our organs are the same. Some appear outside our bodies and some inside the body. As a friend of mine who's a zoologist pointed out to me many years ago, much to my shock, actually. I think this is what I want to say, and now I'd like to open it up to questions. First of all, let's see if there are questions from the participants, and then I'll go to the Q&A.
I can say something, right? It's okay if I
Please.
Okay, so so Miriam, it's very interesting that because when I did kind of latch onto that word shrivel for that scene in the dissecting room, and I too at first said, okay, well, this is Nawal kind of reducing, you know, male and female to being on equal footing, and let's not go. But then all of a sudden, all these symbols came into play, and you're right. So that became this long section of the paper, actually. But here I only started, well, this is a very obvious thing, and then I didn't know what to do with it. I'm like, well, is it an obvious thing? And should I be looking at all these symbols? But again, this is, you know, Nawal liked to have us do things like this, actually. I mean, it was very much within her personality, you know, because on one hand, she would say that, you know, she would try to reduce, you know, and downplay differences between men and women. But then on the other hand, there were many times where she would talk about the superiority of women. She famously told the story of Bedouin women who would reverse their tent when they wanted to get rid of their husbands, and the men were so frightened by that symbol that they wouldn't come near the tent. They knew they had been like they had been thrown out of the couple by the woman. There was nothing more that they could do. And she quite often talked about Egyptian mythology and the superiority of women. So that was some of her contradictions that she presented to us, which in a way just made us think and make these connections that she so desperately wanted us to do, because she saw this fragmentation of knowledge in every aspect of society and life, and even in our own professions. And so this was just kind of her way of playing the devil's advocate. So thanks for that comment.
I'd also like to add one point. Your comments, Miriam, just reminded me of one of the core, I guess, tenets of the wretched of the earth, particularly, which comes as no surprise, is Fanon's insistence that after the hour of liberation, the real work begins in dismantling the system itself and building it anew according to native standards and what we need as a society, each society deciding for itself. But what's interesting about Woman at Point Zero is that Nawal shows us how to do it in the instance that Firdaus kills, spoiler alert, kills her pimp by subverting the act of penetration and stabbing him to death. She's killing the literal embodiment of that oppression, whether political, gendered, or otherwise. And so that's, I think, perhaps a distinction here is that through the narratology, she's able to give us more concrete examples that literary characters actually take on the action, whereas in the more philosophical works, it's a manifesto, it's a call to action, but there's no example of how that action takes place.
Yeah. So let me go to the Q&A, and this is from Afaf Bataine. I think the name is pronounced a little differently from yesterday. And her comment, thank you all for excellent thought-provoking presentations. I'm particularly pleased that almost all of you highlighted the connections between personal, sexual, social, political, and colonial oppressions. I wonder if you can comment on whether adopting a non-Western reading analytical framework, a decolonized lens, would better inform our understanding of Arab feminism, feminist writings. And I would say that the question is directed at Asmaa, who has given us a decolonial theoretical approach.
Oh, thank you so much for this question and for noticing how I'm trying to open Arabic studies and especially like Arab feminism to decolonial readings. So definitely, I mean, by putting Anzal Doua's work and Chicana's works into conversation with Arab women, it can be very, very productive in developing Arab feminism as a theory. I mean, many critics would argue that Arab feminism has risen and fallen, and they try to dig into the reasons why Arab feminism is not present in everyday lives of Arab women as it is present in books and in theories. So I'm not saying that we have to fit Arab feminism into Chicana feminism, but my work tries to develop Arab feminism as a theory. Like my paper today, I mean, unveiling of the mind is clearly like a theoretical lens so that we can understand and look at El Saadawi's work through this unveiling of the mind. But again, I mean, critics until today, they just tend to focus on the oppression or the sexual oppression of Arab women under Islam. But if we try to focus on El Saadawi's work as a theoretical work, I mean, she theorizes, like Dr. Cooke said, like in her fiction and nonfiction writings. So if we look more closely into like unveiling of the mind and try to develop this as a theory and dig into the feminist consciousness of Egyptian women and try to put it in comparison to women of color feminism into the US, I think that will feed Arab feminism at a theoretical lens, and this way we move away from hegemonic comparisons between Victorian women and French feminists, and instead try to look into what a woman of color. I mean, Arab women have not been considered as women of color. I mean, it's the same way Arab Americans are here in the US. We're still considered white. So what is new in my new research is that I claim that Arab women are women of color, and that a woman of color or South-South comparison is valid and can be very empowering and enriching. And I really liked how Dr. Sawafta, that I'm pronouncing it right, like putting Saadawi's work into conversation with Fanon. I think that is very, very brilliant. But I also have a question for you. I mean, Saadawi has not I mean, we talked about how El Saadawi's feminism has evolved throughout the years and has developed. So many of you might agree with me that racism has not been central to El Saadawi's feminism, and that but in recent years, I mean, she urges Egyptians to embrace their Africanness, and she also tries to include race, I believe, in her theoretical feminist framework. So how do you see race in El Saadawi's works manifest itself, or like, do you think that this would be a valid comparison between El Saadawi's works and Fanon as well?
Thank you so much for that question. It gives me another angle from which to consider this. I think two things can be true at once in this regard, that it's similar and not the same, but that also maybe perhaps, I guess if we were to define racism as it pertains to Blackness or colorism, it's one aspect. But if we were to consider racism with in regards to a more general Orientalist outlook, which is this idea that people like Fanon and Saadawi were divorced historically from at least in the European and American imaginary, as being incapable from producing intellectual thought by virtue of their otherness. I think that's perhaps where we can bring in the question of race, although we would have to kind of collapse it into perhaps a broader kind of politics of othering, as opposed to maybe just referring to it very distinctly as racism in our colorist understanding of what racism is. But I see them as part of the same tradition that pushes back in the same way that, you know, the Negritude movement pushed back against this idea that those who are othered are incapable of producing knowledge, and that is precisely why they are othered and oppressed. And I think they both produced their work at a time at such a sensitive colonial, and also in some cases just after, you know, colonialism technically ended, but not, you know, really ended, that it's part of that kind of stance of disproving that myth, that Orientalist myth of knowledge and power and who owns that agency to produce it.
Thank you. We have a couple of, excuse me, a couple of questions in the Q&A. One is from our colleague here at Duke, Mbailo. Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful, this is wonderful and insightful. I'd like from the presenters to reflect on this note below from Nawal's article in this link. أول مظاهر إفريقية هو لون بشرتي. So what the first African مظاهر, I'm not sure how that would be translated, is the color of my skin.
Yeah, the color of my skin. Yeah, yeah. It's the color of my skin is the first sign of my Africanness.
Oh, very nice. Thank you, Shireen. So since I was born, I realized two facts about which there is no doubt. The first is that I am a girl and not a boy like my brother. And the second is that my skin is brown and not white like my mother. And with these two facts, I realized something more important, because these two qualities alone and without any other defects are sufficient to judge my future as failure. So I guess in some ways, this is a comment on Asmaa's discussion of race. Would anyone like to respond to that?
Can I say a word?
Of course.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
not sure that I understand the question. So,
Asmaa, just a minute. Let's give Shireen.
oh, thank you. No, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. These are very interesting interventions, and they highlight more the fiction of Nawal El Saadawi, not to mention her autobiography as well. Speaking of decolonization and the comment that we received now in the Q&A, and racism and all that, I think the beginning of adopting a decolonizing lens, the issue that Afaf brought up, is to think of the colonial legacy, because actually it's the colonial legacy that consolidated the binaries, body, mind, men, women, private, public. So thinking of the colonial legacy, I mean, is the beginning to decolonize knowledge, if one can say so. The other thing, when it comes to racism, so what color, the color Nawal is talking about here in that comment is not the same racism of, let's say, Afro-Americans have gone through. It's different. It's, again, it has to do with the colonial legacy. In the Arab world, a woman should be, you know, with a fair complexion. A fair complexion is one sign of beauty, meaning more options in the marriage market. So she has a future. This is how it is, you know, phrased. So therefore, mind is not important at all. It doesn't matter. You'll just end as a married woman in the house of your husband. So the racism here is kind of different. That's why Nawal was endorsing and celebrating her Africanness. Because when you do this, then that's me, and this is how I look like, and this is the color of my complexion. See, so it's a different kind of racism. Perhaps it's high time that we revisited and we rethought the meaning of racism, because we tend to think of racism as one racism we know, the Black, you know, racism against Black people. There are other kinds and other forms of racism that have to do with the politics of location and politics of othering, as I believe Asmaa mentioned. It's all about othering, and it's all again about binaries. Thank you.
Can I add something? Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Abu Naga, for this. But yeah, I mean, Nawal El Saadawi's work never pleased anybody, like never pleased white people, never pleased Arabs, never pleased Egyptians. So she is rebellious, and I would like to quote her, one of her in one of her theoretical articles, she says the colonialist mind, and it ties to my trying to theorize the unveiling of the mind. She says the colonialist mind, the white mind is the mind of the world. She's very aware of this colonial legacy that ties African people and Arab people as well. And I mean, she identifies herself as an African woman. She believes that actually the term Middle Eastern is a colonial term, and that tries to stay away from this term, and again claim the African heritage of Egyptians, and ties this and ties Egyptian identity to ancient Egyptians, and also African heritage more actually than she does with the Arab and Islamic heritage. And in terms of her activism, I mean, she was and that is just trying to respond to Dr. Ziotal Emma. She's a colleague here at Tulane. Yeah, I mean, she definitely, her work has been put into conversation with African women. And also black women here in the U.S. and many like a lot of research is again trying to connect El Saadawi's feminism with African and with Black feminist thought in the U.S. Actually, Angela Davis, she's one of the prominent feminists in the U.S., a Black feminist. She visited Egypt in 1970s, and she didn't meet with El Saadawi herself, but she did meet with the organizers or the members of El Saadawi's association. And she, in her book, Women and Culture, she has a chapter on her visit in Egypt, and she notices that how let's say she mentioned Zayat actually, that Zayat and other feminists actually rejected the Western imposition on sexual oppression of Arab women under Islam, and most of the women she met were against the Western imperialism that tries to eliminate the intersectional oppression of Arab women. And I think that is very, very, very pioneering in establishing solidarity between Egyptian women and Black women in the US. And that goes back actually to, I believe, Angela Davis, transnational feminism. And I believe this work is an early transnational feminist work.
Part of Miriam, can I say something? Sorry, Miriam. Miriam, can I say something?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. A part of extending the colonial legacy, I mean, that's why I always have doubts about the term post-colonial. Because post-colonial is not post-colonial, it's just another colonial, neo-colonial or whatever. Now we call it neoliberal. Part of extending that legacy, please notice that all the famous cosmetic companies Chanel, Yves Saint Laurent, I don't know what, I mean, name it. They have this line of production specially made for the third world about whitening the complexion, how to whiten your complexion. And this is very popular, really popular. So it's the dream of every woman, you know, to be just as white as Snow White. I see this as, again, part of the colonial legacy that one needs to remember, you know, just to decolonize, to start, because this is the route to subjectivity formation, or rather to reclaim subjectivity, which was one of the main issues Saadawi is talking about in two women and Woman at Point Zero. It's all about subjectivity and what impedes forming this subjectivity. There is always a wider society and institutions that would limit even the options for reclaiming this subjectivity. So for example, reclaiming this subjectivity would lead to being a prostitute who is going to be executed. So it's all about that. It all should begin from the colonial legacy as I see it. And when I say, of course, the colonial legacy, I mean how women were immediately taken to be the cultural marker of identity. Thus, they were incarcerated in the private sphere so that identity is just clear and clear demarcated and all that. So this is what I mean by the colonial legacy, because things were not always like that. I mean, if you read, for example, that book by Judith Tucker about Egyptian women in the 19th century, you will notice the big difference. So it's just a reaction to colonization that we need to protect identity. And who is the marker for that? It's just women. So let's impose things on women.
Thank you, Shireen. I think we should now take a 5-minute break and then come back at 12:05 for the wrap-up session. Chance to stretch our legs. See you in a few minutes, in 5 minutes. Hi, Hind.
Hi, Miriam. I'm so much better. Thank you so much. I
was worried.
I had a little bit of a scare. Like I woke up in the morning and I was coughing.
I'm gonna come right back. Go into the wrap-up session. Is everybody there?
We are right there, all of us. Yeah.
Great. So are we broadcasting or not yet? Okay, great. Well, thank you to all the participants. This has been very days. And I'm sad that there have not been any other fora for a discussion of Nawal Saadawi's work after her death. And I hope that maybe we will see more conferences like this one that really probe into her work, into her life, into her extraordinary contributions. And so now I would like to have Hind, Ahmed Zaki, my co-conspirator co-organizer, just say a couple of words, and then we will have each panelist give a short reaction to what we have all heard over the past 2 days. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to start by saying that Shireen just pointed out that it is iftar time in Egypt and the rest of the Muslim world right now. So iftar Mubarak, everyone. And I understand if people can tune in larger numbers, maybe because of Ramadan and iftar. Thank you, Shireen, for bringing this to our attention. But I just want to quickly say to those who are here and to everyone that it's been my honor and pleasure to actually co-organize this conference. Miriam and I just can't thank Miriam enough. She just contacted me. We did not know each other before this, and she just contacted me as, you know, a wonderful, amazing, and like renowned scholar of Arabic literature seeking me out, and I'm like an assistant professor, and we didn't know each other before. And so my collaboration with Mariam, I would say, expresses the best of academic feminist collaboration that I have had the pleasure of enjoying and doing since a very long time. This means a lot to me. I just want to say that. And I can't thank enough all the presenters. You have really made us rethink, as I said yesterday, of so many of the themes that we had taken for granted in Nawal's work, as well as in her life. Like listening to these presentations and just thinking about the richness of the legacy left by Nawal is just, you know, the thing that comes to my mind now. Can we make this like an annual conference of sorts? Because honestly, we're just scratching the surface here, honestly, all of us. And I feel that there's so many conversations that were cut off because of, you know, we didn't have enough time and space for it. So my dream is to kind of like have this be done regularly, where we can unearth more and more of the legacy of El Saadawi. We have looked at so many different aspects of this: the activism, the life, the memoirs, the fiction. And in this last panel, the kind of like the idea of colonialism and post-colonialism and race and all of these fascinating aspects, all of them. So I just want to thank you all. It's been an incredible couple of days, and I can't wait for us to collaborate again, whether in person or online or in the form of a publication, where we can actually further explore these wonderful, very rich and living legacy of Nawal El Saadawi, I would dare say. Thank
you. Shireen, would you like to make a couple of remarks?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Not to mention, it was an eye-opener to many other issues that still need to be further researched in Nawal's legacy. Just to build on what Hind has just said, it just occurred to my mind that there is, you know, something called Society of Foucault, Society of William Wordsworth, and so on and so forth. So you can guys think of something like that.
Should start like that, honestly. Yeah.
With a specific theme every year, every time. Yeah, so that you can limit it. Like, I mean, putting Nawal in conversation with Fanon, that was a brilliant idea. Reading Nawal from a decolonized lens, whatever. I noticed that during the two panels and the discussions, we need to also rethink the meaning of feminism, because apparently each one of us means something different by the word feminism. It's a very general word, and even when we say Arab feminism, because you know there are feminisms and there are Arab feminisms, so perhaps we need to think of this more, what we mean exactly by feminism. So a woman writing or doing anything would be a feminist, because, you know, there is womanist and feminist. Also the difference between, also we need to rethink the meaning of activism, because just writing and teaching or lecturing, this is also another form of activism. This is, I mean, knowledge production is a form of activism. Especially that Nawal was not part of any political party. She was not part of any, you know, specific community. And the only thing there was that the only thing she had was the Ausa, and that was, as we all know, closed down. So she depended mainly on her books, her fiction, her lectures, and recently in her life, the articles she published in the dailies. So again, the word activism should be very clear. And I don't know why we expect from Nawal to have talked about everything, you know, why we're burdening her with that. See, we can't expect this to what racism, LGBT, and she talked about these, but in between the lines, and because she was talking about issues taken from material reality, the reality she was living in. So we can't expect her to have said everything. The main issue for Nawal was body and mind. They are one, and they are the same as those of men. In other words, gender as a social construct. And of course, later on, she talked about how it is also a psychological construct, how it is a political construct, and all that. So for her, gender was a construct. And yes, she wanted to blur the lines between gender and sex. This is just to prove her point that the uterus is the penis is the uterus, and all that. So, and so borders, crossing borders, or rather trespassing borders, which brings us again to the Chicana issue, because Chicana is all about borders. Yes, crossing borders was the main concern for Nawal. And borders, the word in Arabic, al-hudud, is very important in the Arabo-Islamic culture. If you go, for example, to the Islamic Encyclopedia that was published by Brill in the Netherlands, you will find a separate entry for al-hudud. Okay, so borders is a very important concept in the Arabo-Islamic culture, as I've just said. And if you go back to the memoirs of Fatima al-Mirnisi, Women Trespassing, I can't remember the title in English.
The trespass, I was just teaching it last semester. And yeah, she discusses al-hudud very much. It's a major.
Actually, that's the opening sentence. This is the opening sentence in her memoir. علمني أبي دائما أن هناك حدود بيننا وبين النصارى. Who are النصارى? The French colonizers. So الحدود is a very important aspect, and that's why Nawal caused a lot of controversies, courts. She is the woman who wanted all the time to trespass borders. She wouldn't accept borders at all. At all. So, and this is very clear, or could be discerned clearly in the way she was thinking, the way she was writing, even her writings. She doesn't stick to the genre. I mean, she doesn't stick to the genre at all. And nobody wants to see the others crossing borders, because, you know, it just upsets the people who cross borders. It's like, you know, the Western concept of no trespass. And it's even, I think, a legal charge if you trespass private property of somebody. See, so this is actually what Nawal was doing. Think of it this way: she was trespassing private property. What is the private property? Women's, females, the female body. This is the private property of, name it, patriarchy, masculinity, family, all the institutions you can think of. So she was trespassing that.
Let me just quickly add here that the way that Hind and I got together was when Hind participated in Hiwar Mutamaddin, and there were three old guys, probably not as old as I am, but still pretty old. And each one was going on about, oh, she didn't, you know, she was trespassing on my discipline. No, she was on my discipline. And Hind is like,
okay. Yeah. So even interdisciplinarity.
I went mad.
That's private property.
Yeah, the experts.
Thank you.
Of the field. Thank you. That was an amazing event. Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed every bit of it. Thank you.
Thank you. You were wonderful. And in closing, you're also wonderful because you have come up with, I think, a brilliant idea. And that is like the Simone de Beauvoir Society. We need a Nawal El Saadawi Society. And I nominate you the president. I do. Oh, I think everybody's agreeing, so you have no choice. We'll elect you.
You're gonna do it, Shireen. Khalas, we're doing it. I'm coming into Cairo this summer and we're discussing this and you're doing it.
Oh, if you're going to be in Cairo, we're all going to go to Cairo. We'll be with you.
Let's all go to Cairo this summer and just do that. Yeah, let's all ask for funding from our institutions, meet in Cairo and start this society.
I love that.
COVID anymore, so please come and stay. Please, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. So now I want to just quickly go through, and we'll go through in the order in which the presentations were made. And, you know, just whatever is in your head, one comment, two comments. So let us start with Jessica. Jessica, we haven't heard from you for a long time.
Not since yesterday. Thank you. So I wanted to thank the organizers again, but I also wanted to thank my fellow panelists. I very much have enjoyed this conference, and it's been a very productive conference for me. I have a list of questions rather than answers, which I think for me means it's how productive this conference has been, because of course asking questions is what you want to do when you're going back to do more analysis. So some of the questions that keep rising, and this is, you know, cutting across, you know, several of the papers and a lot of the presentations in the last 2 days. So one of the questions that keeps coming up for me is who's allowed to be an expert and when they're allowed to be an expert. What is feminist leadership? That was something that came up, and you know, Shireen was just talking about what does feminism mean, but I think also the question of what is feminist leadership. Of course, the question about what are the interconnections between class, colonialism, patriarchy. Those I had already been asking, but today's panels then also made me think about what are the interconnections too between the mind and the body, and this is something that I had not been exploring yet in my own work. And then Shireen earlier asked this question: what impedes the formation of subjectivity or agency of women, but also of the colonized? So that's something that I'm asking myself now. And then lastly, how do we treat a quote unquote force of nature? You know, so someone who cannot be argued with, someone who cannot be controlled, and someone who we cannot change in our analyses of Al Saadawi. And again, what is the legacy of Al Saadawi? So those are just some of the questions that I have. And I just, again, I wanted to thank all of my fellow panelists and the organizers for putting this together. I've had a great time.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm just jumping to say very important questions. I thank you so much for posing them, and they give us food for thoughts for future collaborations, meetings, and yeah, very important.
Unmute myself. Sorry, there was a bug that I had to get rid of on my desk. Okay, Muhammad.
So thank you so much for this, and just to kind of like reiterating what everyone else has said, that this has been an incredible experience, and it's been amazing to hear all of your discussions. And I think the thing that's kind of like really stuck out to me through all of this is something that I think either Laila Bouloughed or Sarah Ahmed said, which is kind of like, if the pursuit of kind of like knowledge of the personal takes you away from the road to quote unquote true knowledge, then pursue that road to kind of like more personal knowledge, because there is something there to be uncovered. And I feel like
this is definitely Sarah Ahmed.
Sarah Ahmed. Okay.
Emotion. Yeah.
Okay. And then yes, and it feels like that's the thing that I kind of like took away from that, is how embodied kind of like Nawal's feminism was. And through listening to all of the presenters speak about the various ways that she actually kind of like you said, kind of like not just a writer and activist, she embodied all of those things, and they appeared in so many different ways. And that's pretty much what I'm taking away from that, is the importance when it comes to kind of like exploring feminism, and especially decolonization. And of course, that means kind of like decolonizing feminism as well. It's important to kind of like prioritize personal experiences of people. And that obviously kind of like is important, particularly when we consider the question of race as well. Because if we don't put the personal front and center, then we risk kind of like having all of the institutional and kind of like systemic injustices seep back in and actually corrupt any sort of knowledge that we might come up with. So yeah, I think that's it.
Muhammad. And you know, at the first meeting of the Nawal El Saadawi Society that will be hosted by Shireen Abu Naga, I would like to suggest that you create the most beautiful Nawal pot, a metaphysical pot for Nawal.
I would absolutely love to, and we'll have to do it in Fayoum, because that's the pottery hub in Egypt. So
you guys,
yeah, Ibrahim, we're going to be coming to you.
We're all kind of like giving you as many incentives as possible. Cairo, Fayoum, we're going to the Nile, we're gonna do a pottery show. This is gonna be fun.
Exactly, it's happening.
I love it. Lucinda.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm just very grateful to have been involved in this wonderful conference. I learned so much, and I loved the rich readings of texts that everyone did. Made me think about them in new ways. I guess I felt energized by Nawal as a dreamer, as someone who could envision new possibilities in all kinds of directions, and who really believed in her visions. And I feel like hearing each of the papers here has kind of expanded those dreams for me. You know, the links that you guys made, and the questions about binaries too, and this lovely idea of Nawal as a trespasser. So anyway, that's really all I have to say. I really, really enjoyed this conference, and I appreciate the organizers, and I can't wait to hear more about the Nawal El Saadawi Society.
Thank you. Great, Cheryl.
Okay, thanks so much. And again, I was so inspired by all of your papers, and Miriam, I've known for a long time, although we haven't had any contact in recent years. So this was a wonderful occasion to reconnect. Hind, I'm so happy that even though we're virtual, that I got to meet you in this way. The two of you work so well together. I mean, and it's even a better story that you didn't know each other personally before, like working together on this project. So I really, that it really set the tone and the ambiance for the whole event. And so the success of this event really has to go to you too. And Shireen, you were the perfect keynote speaker. You know, I mean, I think all of us have been working on Nawal's works for some time, and that we all, you know, we think that we know what's in there, but it's good to hear things reiterated, because once again, it has that impact when you hear it. So Shireen reminded us of that decolonization of knowledge that Nawal insisted on all the time, and that also that women's bodies are a web of power relations. I wrote that quote when she said it in her keynote, you know, and it really is a very powerful few words put together like that, and it really sums up Nawal's work. Really, I could thank you all for, you know, contributing to, you know, more insights on my own paper, for example, but just on my work in general. I have to say, I mean, this is kind of comical actually now, but an Egyptian friend of mine sent me the announcement for the call for papers. And I read, you know, I chair my department, so I have 300 to 500 emails a day, it seems. So like I have like, is this one worth reading? Is this one worth reading? And so, but I saw body, medicine, and feminism. And right away, and I was going to go back to it later in the evening, and I said, oh, medicine, maybe this isn't for me. You know, maybe this isn't my topic at all. And then, and I read the description. It's like, huh, well, this, you know, you weren't certain when you read the description, you know, what could it be something that I'm working on? And then I saw it was a Duke, and then I connected with Miriam, and so I said, okay, so this encouraged me to kind of fit into this call for me, which in a way was very broad, you know, but like so broad that sometimes, you know, but it shows you that we're all interdisciplinary scholars, and that even we have boundaries sometimes. And so you can imagine that if we have boundaries, that there are a lot of people like Nawal had fought against, you know, who are really in these categories. And this is really kind of what causes chaos in the world. So thank you for bringing us up to that challenge, to look at what our own borders are in our research and our own constraints, and to break through and to kind of dare to propose something and to be part of this wonderful team at this conference. I really appreciate this. I also appreciate Mohammed and how he reminded us about Nawal's equal opportunity criticism of the East and the West. And that's so very important to understand what's going on globally in the past with colonialism, also in today's world. Lucinda and Ibrahim, and talking about Nawal's time in prison, and also those narratives, and that to remind us that, you know, that a pen and a paintbrush and words are all weapons, just like real arms and what we think of arms of war to be, that this is all just as powerful. And then finally, to Jessica, bringing the Hoskins report forth. I was really fascinated by that, because I'm teaching a course on women in the Arab world now, and it's really about Arab feminism. And I brought in the Hoskins report to my students, and they're just undergrads in a core course. So these aren't specialists, these aren't graduate students. And they do see now, and you know, they do see how Western behaviors have prevented a transnational feminism. And it's really kind of our fault as Westerners who have done that. But 20 years ago, I'm not so sure undergraduates in a core course would have seen that. And I think it's because of voices like Nawal. If I can single her out, because we had started with her before we brought the Hoskins report to class, but she, you know, really had a lot, and because of her, the way that she was able to voice those concerns and got everybody thinking, you know, really the affects young people today. And when Hind talked about how young Egyptian feminists look at her today, you know, I kind of wanted to reanalyze my character, because many people, because that translation was just reprinted in 2020, a lot of people think that that's a posthumous writing of Nawal, that she, you know, must have published that, written the manuscript right before she died. And actually that's an old piece, you know, from 85. You know, but you could see where people would think that, because the character is, you know, it could be someone living in 2022 today. So when Hind talked about how young Egyptian feminists look at Nawal's work, it made me rethink this character. So really, and anyone I didn't mention, it wasn't because you didn't inspire me. It's just there's so much, and we only have the 2 minutes. But thank you to everybody, and I really am like honored to be part of this group.
Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So Ibrahim, he lost connectivity. So somebody's going to have to tell him that next year he's hosting a big event. So I'll tell him also, but it'd be good to encourage him to prepare.
In
So
Fayoum. We're all going to Fayoum. So
we're going to
you will
Fayoum.
host us all in Fayoum.
We're starting in Cairo, I think. We're having a
Starting
party
in Cairo with Shireen, and then we're moving to Fayoum with Ibrahim. And who knows
It's a
what
road
else?
trip.
Maybe
Yeah.
it's a road trip, and we'll come up with other stops on the way. So
Yeah.
stay tuned.
If it's summer, maybe Sahel.
Say hello. Stay tuned.
So yeah, he missed something.
No, he's
So,
probably just having iftar now. He's probably eating. Yeah, probably.
Pretending that he's got lack of connectivity. No, he wouldn't do that.
He'll be back.
Okay, Asmaa.
Well, I really enjoyed this panel, and thank you so much for hosting this. I think Nawal El Saadawi will be very happy to see that her legacy didn't end by her passing away. I was actually working on the chapter last year on her books, and when I heard the news about her passing away, so that was really hard. I was completing my dissertation at the time, but yeah, I mean, I'm really inspired by all the papers that are presented in this conference. I'm really happy to be a part of it. We talked a lot about the humanization of medicine, the binaries, the rebellion of El Saadawi and her crossing of borders, which is central to my research as well. And it's really hard to compartmentalize or categorize El Saadawi as a person. But still, the scholarship today, especially Western scholarship today, tends to categorize her works and I think they do not pay justice to her feminism, which some of us would agree that it is intersectional in a way that it includes LGBTQ rights and race. Others might disagree, but still, I mean, she her death was as provocative as her life was, and I really think that we need more of these discussions and the body of work that she left it for us to grapple with and to try to understand and expand as well. And I think she actually mentioned that she will be remembered, maybe not during her lifetime, but after her death. And I'm seeing that happening. So again, I mean, it has been a pleasure to be with you today, and I would love to see more of this happening.
Thank you. And Suja.
Thank you. I just want to start out by thanking all of the organizers again, Miriam, Hind, Ellen, and Griffin. Thank you so much for facilitating this process. This conference came at a time of family and health turbulence for me, and so many accommodations were made to make it possible for me to still attend, so I'm super thankful. I also just want to also thank Miriam specifically, because she's the one who introduced me to Nawal El Saadawi a decade ago. I was actually her student, and so it's a special honor for me to be back here with her and among you all. She changed my life, honestly. Miriam changed my life. So she's hashishat qalbi, as we say in our family. I always refer to her as the one that blossoms in my heart. So I'm especially thankful to be here. And I want to thank you all. Every single person here taught me something new. I think one of the main challenges I face with this type of work, especially as a professor now, is the way in which students react to it and how to relay sort of the legacy in the most pure and intentional form, while also I guess, facilitating some of the very visceral and real reactions that happen in class when we read some of these works. That it can be triggering for students who've gone through trauma and sexual violence specifically. And so I'm finding myself in this precarious situation of having to make sure that I'm gentle as a humanist, as a professor, in the way that Nawal would have wanted us to, and also not compromising on my delivery of a lecture that engages with such difficult topics. And so every single one of you all have taught me a new dimension to this work, and by extension, a way of perhaps tackling some of the challenges that come out of teaching this type of literature. And without fail, I mean, Woman at Point Zero, every year, there's a student that gets up and says, I'm really sorry, I have to leave the class. And then there are other students who are like, this has changed my life. I couldn't put it down. I read it in an hour. And I think the same could be said for so many of her other books. So I thank you all again for this learning opportunity. And as for the Nawal El Saadawi Society, I'm all in. I'm Palestinian, but I recently took a DNA test and it turns out I'm 26% Egyptian. I just recently found out. So this might be the perfect opportunity for me to revisit.
By the way, Suja, you don't have to be 25% Egyptian.
No, I know.
Everybody out there.
Yeah, of course. But I'm just, I think it's all serendipitous how this conference came to the fore at the time I found out some of my DNA breakdown. And so, so I am, again, thank you again for having me, for including me in this conversation. And I look forward to seeing where it all goes in the future.
Let me just make a quick comment about the gentle. You said that she was gentle in her teaching, but she was also fierce. And I would say that she broke down another binary, and that is the gentle, fierce binary. So thank you for that. Hind, any closing comments?
Did everybody talk? Why do I feel that we missed somebody?
Ibrahim he's preparing the conference for next year.
He's preparing the conference, so he's off. He's off preparing already the next conference. Yeah, other than to say thank you all so much. This had been honestly a pleasure. I look forward to further collaborations, and I thank you all for your insights and for the many layers that you had exposed to us about Nawal. And we can talk about Nawal forever. It's not going to end there. So the society thing is happening. I'll make sure that I just want to ensure everybody that this is going to be my summer project, and I'll make it happen along with Shireen and Ibrahim, even though he's not here, he's going to do it. So yeah, looking forward to all of you. And it was wonderful meeting all of you as well, even virtually. And I look forward to many further collaborations in the future. And this society will extend the family of those who are interested in Nawal El Saadawi in North America, not just in North America, but also in the Middle East. And there are so many of us, by the way. Like, you have no idea how much, when I posted about this to an Arab audience, people were so interested to attend. Many people in the US, and as Asmaa's presentation and Suja's and others today had shown us, there's so many trajectories and interlinkages with Shikana, with Africana with African feminists, with so many others. There's such an interest in Nawal El Saadawi as a feminist writer, thinker, and activist. So there's a lot of room for things to do in the future, with also a lot of collaborations with other people that we can think of and who would be very I think enthusiastic about this. So on this positive note and optimistic note for the future, I just wish to end it here, and thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you, Hind, for being a wonderful partner in this process.
Thank you. Likewise, Miriam.
Everyone. This has been great. So next year in Fayoum.
Sure. Thank you very much. See you all again soon.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.